Good evening, everyone. My name is Kate Griffin, and I'm the International Programme Director at the British Centre for Literary Translation. It's my pleasure and honour to introduce this year's Sebald Lecture, which will be given by Boris Akunin. I'm particularly grateful to Boris for fighting off the flu today and joining us here this evening. Boris Akunin is one of the most widely read authors in Russia, and he's been compared to authors such as Gogol, Tolstoy, and Arthur Conan Doyle. His best-selling detective novels are translated into English by Andrew Bromfield, and he's published here by Weidenfeld and Nicholson. Since 1998, Boris Akunin has published around 50 titles in a number of different series. He's best known for the Erast Fanderin detective novels, which span the period from 1876 to 1914, and which contain references to writers ranging from Turgenev to Dostoevsky to Agatha Christie. They've sold 13 million copies in Russia and have been adapted for film and television. Boris Akunin has also published the Sister Pelagia series about a crime-solving nun in early 20th century provincial Russia, as well as various other genre novels, adaptations, and screenplays. And as well as the Boris Akunin novels, he's also published novels under the names Anatoly Brusnikin and Anna Borisova. In 2012, last year, Boris Akunin published Aristonomy, which he describes as his first serious novel. It's a mixture of fiction and quasi-documentary style. This novel comes out under the name of Akunin Chkhatishvili, which is his main pseudonym and his real name. For in his previous life, and when we first met back in the 1990s, Boris Akunin was Grigory Chkhatishvili, an editor at the Foreign Literature magazine in Moscow, and a translator of Japanese literature into Russian. So in his lecture tonight, Boris Akunin, or perhaps Grigory Chkhatishvili, will talk to us about his love for translating, how translating both helped and hindered his work as a writer, and why he misses it now. Thank you.
It's an honor and a privilege to be here speaking in front of you, and doubly so because speaking about my former profession, literary translation, is pleasant, nostalgic, and quite unusual for me. Back in Russia, nobody wants to hear about my experience as a translator. After I became an author, I developed an irresistible affection to divide everything into chapters. I divide my day into chapters. And of course, if I write even a text which is relatively short, I also divide it into chapters. So this talk is divided into 3 chapters. I don't know why. Chapter 1 is called The Second Cleanest Profession in the USSR. My mother wanted me to become a doctor. If not a doctor, then a literary translator. She would start speaking about my future and say with conviction that in our country there were only 2 clean professions. Firstly, medicine, secondly, literary translation. She wouldn't be more specific, so I took it as an axiom. When she saw that I was hopeless at chemistry and physics, and that I showed little interest in biology, she started pushing me towards the second option. She was a school teacher. She knew how to manipulate people. Just one example of her scheming. At home, there was a bookshelf up very high where, mother told me, were the books for adults. I was not to touch them until I was old enough to understand them. Of course, when I was alone, I read them all to the last page. I was probably the youngest living creature in the world to read the 2 volumes of Anna Karenina and the 4 volumes of War and Peace. I didn't understand much, but I developed a lifelong habit of reading difficult books. To interest me in reading books in English, the language I was studying at school without much enthusiasm, my mother took me to the Moscow Library of Foreign Literature, recently reopened after renovation. The building was brand new, all glass and steel. In socialist Moscow of 1969, it looked like a miracle of modernity, a temple of light. Even the compulsory Lenin statue was not like the one at my school, 3 meters high and gilded, but small, sort of cubist, very chic. And there were no kids, as no one under 16 could get a subscription. I immediately felt that I wanted to belong to that world. Even the queue behaved differently from all other Soviet queues. Everybody was so polite, so patient, so soft-spoken. They are all translators, I thought. I also thought I understood why translation was a profession second only to medicine in its sterile attire. I demanded that mother take out a subscription for me in her name. Then I was allowed to take a book. Not knowing what to order, I chose the thickest volume from the display and promised myself I would read it to the end no matter what. Hadn't I read War and Peace after all? Unfortunately, the book turned out to be The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. In the beginning, I had to write out at least 50 unknown words from each page. I did force my way through it. I had to keep my word. But I've never touched a Steinbeck book since then. An adolescent trauma. The second English book, Scaramouche by Raphael Sabatini, was a relief, a treat. I started translating it immediately for a friend who was unlucky enough to have to study German at school. After a couple of pages, I found it easier to tell the story in my own words, embellishing it along the way, a premonition of what was going to become of me eventually. But at 13, I didn't want to be a writer. I wanted to translate. The real meaning of what my mother had in mind when she called literary translation a clean profession, and why it was less clean than medicine, became clear to me later, as I was growing up and learning the art of adjusting to the real world. Here I must digress in order to explain the rather specific position of writers and philologists in the Soviet Union. Adolf Hitler was a failed painter. Joseph Stalin was a failed poet. Stalin must have envisaged his dictatorship as some sort of epic poem, the beauty of which should be admired. And it was admired genuinely or falsely, voluntarily or otherwise. In any case, no criticism of that great work of poetry was tolerated. It was bad luck for Russian literature that Stalin thought highly of literature. For him to think highly meant that literature was politically important. The dictator grew up in an era when Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Chekhov were iconic figures in Russia, influencing not only Russian literature, but the whole of society. Stalin evidently despised all three of them for their uselessness and even harmfulness. He needed his own socialist Tolstoys. And with his arithmetical practical-mindedness, his endless contempt for human nature, he was sure that he knew how to achieve this goal. The chaotic and uncontrollable world of literary creation had to be put in order. Stalin directed and organized the process, as it was called then. He put the nightingale in a gilded cage by founding in 1934 the Writers' Union, which put Soviet authors in a privileged position both financially and status-wise in return for complete loyalty. Those writers who didn't agree to be locked in a cage or who misbehaved in the cage were purged or barred from publishing. The majority, though, didn't mind playing by the rules. By the end of the Soviet era, there were some 10,000 registered members in the Writers' Union. Candidates would conspire for years trying to get there. When I was a student in the 1970s, writing was a coveted profession, but at the same time, there was something shameful about it. In Moscow and in Leningrad, there were quite a number of informal literary clubs and groups whose members actually took pride in the fact that they didn't want to be published. Those people would ask about a new name. Is she a poet or a published poet? Is he a writer or a writers' union member? That's why my mother didn't want me to become a writer. For her and her milieu, it definitely wasn't a clean profession. But literary translation was. Stalin's directorship of the writing world was awful for Russian literature, which quickly lost all of its previous greatness, but it proved to be a blessing for literary translation. When authors of talent, even of genius, were not allowed to publish their works, or were afraid to write the way they wanted, they turned to translation. Boris Pasternak was secretly writing his Dr. Zhivago while surviving on translations of Shakespeare, Keats, or Schiller. Anna Akhmatova, banned from publishing her own poems, earned her living by translating Chinese and Korean classics. Mikhail Zoshchenko had to translate Finnish prose, and he did it brilliantly. That's what almost all the big guns did. They translated other authors' works. As a result, the school of Soviet translation rose to an incredible height. It had its own stars, even cult figures. A literary translator, even if he was a member of the despised Writers' Union, was welcome in any underground literary club, even the most snobbish of them. And still, it was less clean than medicine. Here, my mother was right again. The rose of literary translation was not without its thorns. You couldn't translate just any author you wanted and then offer it to a publisher, no way. There was an undisclosed but widely known list of forbidden and half-forbidden writers, the latter category including the aforementioned Steinbeck, for instance. Of all his novels, I think only The Grapes of Wrath, with its description of the hardships of the Depression, was approved for publishing. And it was always safer to translate a writer who was already dead. With living authors, one never knew what to expect. A progressive writer and a big friend of the Soviet Union, that was a cliché, a sort of honorary title, could say something stupid about Czechoslovakia, the dissidents, or, God forbid, Solzhenitsyn, and never be published in Russian again. Anything at all could happen. There was a Japanese author, Abe Kobo, considered to be undoubtedly progressive, because he was, I think, a member of the Communist Party of Japan. His prose was very popular in the Soviet Union of the 1960s and 70s. Translations of Abe made the translator, my professor at university, a celebrity in his own right. Then, Abe fell out of grace with the Japanese communists. They reported on him to Moscow, and Abe immediately became a persona non grata for Soviet publishers, and professional tragedy for his translator, my professor. I remember this tragedy very vividly. Another thorn was censorship, and I do not mean political censorship. All dubious authors and titles would have been excluded at the pre-translation stage. No, it was a peculiar sort of censorship called moral ethical editing. There could be no sexually explicit descriptions in a published text. An editor would cross out all the immoral scenes, and if it couldn't be done without ruining the logic of the plot, the editor would urge the translator to soften the sharp angles, as it was called. In the 1980s, when I started to work for the magazine Foreign Literature, all these restrictions were still in force. So, being an editor, I had plenty of opportunity to see how it worked. It was very Victorian, actually. Some things were not mentioned, some words did not exist. I remember our proofreader correcting the word orgasm to organism without the slightest hesitation. The lady thought it was a misprint. Oh yes, and that reminds me of the most celebrated misprint in the history of the magazine Foreign Literature. A typesetter, probably hungover or not quite sober, composed Marxism de Sade instead of Marquise de Sade. So, when I was young, literary translation could not be called an impeccably clean profession. Second cleanest was more like it. I wanted to translate and to live by translation, but not like that, picking my authors from among the progressive friends of the USSR and softening the sharp angles afterwards. So, I find a compromise. Which brings us to chapter 2, which is called The Bliss of Translation. On graduating from university, I did become a translator, and I began to earn my living by practicing this trade. But I kept work and pleasure apart. For money, I translated technical documents, scientific articles, patents, licenses. It paid well, and it was as clean as medicine. And for my own pleasure, I translated fiction, books that impressed me and were a challenge for my translation skills. I didn't even try to find a publisher. It would have been hopeless and maybe even risky. For an audience, I had my friends. They were unpublished writers and poets. I was an unpublished translator. It was absolutely normal for the time. Besides, I had my wife. Her marital duty was to read and retype my translations, and of course, to say what a wonderful translator I was. So my audience was small but reliable. I must say that it was the most cloudless period of my whole career as a translator. Pure art unsoiled by greed. There are a lot of bonuses for someone who translates just for himself. No deadlines, you go as fast as you want, and you work only when you feel like working. In later years, I learned to translate quickly, sometimes very quickly. It felt like gulping down a bottle of fine wine, splashing some of the precious liquid in the process, because a publisher would be tapping me impatiently on the shoulder. In the blessed times of the samizdat, you didn't care whether your translation would sell or not. The print run was determined by how many copies your typewriter could produce. Mine produced 4. And when I was sitting down to translate, it was leisure, not work. I loved every minute and every stage of it. You know that there are different metaphors concerning literary translation. The one most frequently used likens translation to transplanting a foreign tree or flower into local soil while harming it as little as possible. Alexander Pushkin, rather condescendingly, said that translators were the post-horses of enlightenment. Working on a translation, I felt neither a horse nor a gardener. For me, it was more like restoring a work of art covered by an ugly and irritating layer of foreign language that didn't let Russians admire it. This work of art was a mosaic. My task was to clean every tiny tessera. They were fragile, very easy to break, so I had to be careful with my brush. Careful but not timid. If you were too cautious, you could restore every single piece of the mosaic but harm its magic. I knew that a translation which was mathematically correct but devoid of the translator's personality would kill the magic. With a language so distant from my own as Japanese, translating prose was like translating poetry. Freedom and inspiration were the key words. Grammar was a trap, an enemy. I know many translations from Japanese where all the weight goes to the last part of a phrase, because in Japanese, the end of a sentence determines everything. The Russian sentence is flexible and loose. Putting the stress on the ending makes a phrase sound pompous and heavy. Irony and humor are expressed by other means. Exquisiteness and coarseness function differently. Allusions and metaphors belong to another cultural universe. A translator from Japanese must be very resourceful, sometimes even cheeky. I found my favorite author almost immediately. He had 2 irresistible features. First, he was an absolute taboo in the USSR. Second, he was impossibly hard to translate. I'm talking about Yukio Mishima, famous for his style and notorious for his ideology, which eventually led him to harakiri. In the Soviet Union, Mishima was considered to be an epitome of decadence, moral corruption, and political subversion, a devil reincarnate. We future Japanologists were not given his books to read, but I remembered from my university literature course the titles of Mishima's poisonous books. They all seemed to be hymns to something awful. The novel Confessions of a Mask was a hymn to perversity. The novel Kinkakuji was a hymn to destruction. The novel Patriotism was a hymn to suicide, and the play My Friend Hitler was naturally a hymn to Hitler. It all sounded so intriguing that I became Mishima's fan even before I had actually read his books. With time, I translated all the aforementioned titles and many more. Mishima taught me many things on the professional level. I shall mention just one of them, the most important of all. When I was translating Kinkakuji, the Temple of the Golden Pavilion, as it is known in the West, I had at hand the English translation, very meticulous, authorized by Mishima himself. Everything was impeccably correct, and yet I felt that something was amiss. You see, Mishima is not a clever author. Most of his ideas about life and society would leave you uninterested. Neither is he an especially gifted builder of plots. The story isn't his forte. With Mishima, the nuances are more important than the ideas he advances. Shade means so much more than light. But his narration is so elegant, his style so powerful, that it makes up for the banalities and showing off. There is plenty of shallowness in Mishima's works, but strangely, it only increases the impression of genuineness and beauty. It turns into a melody that I can always hear when I am reading Mishima. In the English translation, this melody was silent. The saddest disappointment were the descriptions of nature. Mishima is famous for his landscapes. Everybody knows that describing skies, meadows, and mountains is the hardest thing in modern fiction. It usually looks so unnecessary, so pretentious, so boring. I always miss out those bits when reading. When writing, I keep to the golden rule: the shorter, the better. It was raining, the sky was cloudy, and that's it. Not so with Mishima. You can actually see what he describes, and landscape is always an important part of his narration. His descriptions of nature can be quite long, but you are never bored. How does he achieve this, I wondered? And how can I reproduce this effect in translation? I remember how I tried to translate a fragment describing a sea view from Kinkakuji. I read it several times, each time differently, and still I was not satisfied. There was no deadline, you remember. Then I understood that the secret lay in the sounds. The passage had to be read aloud. It was like a mantra, the combination of sounds and words. The trick was to capture this combination, not the meaning. And when I translated the passage again, making it sound like a mantra in Russian too, I liked the result. Then I discovered that every single phrase in Mishima's book is a mantra. A sentence becomes a mantra when every word is in its exact place and cannot be changed for another word. Every syllable is a part of a mosaic and cannot be moved. It's like a poem, only in prose there is more oxygen, more air. In order to make a good translation of Mishima, I had to become a Russian Mishima inside, which, of course, is easier said than done. Do you know how Mishima describes the process of writing? It feels, he said, as if you have settled the planet and are flying through the universe with stars whizzing by and scratching your cheeks. Well, that's the picture I tried to imagine before sitting down to translate Kinkakuji. Sometimes it even worked. After a while, I discovered a very useful trick. Since every good book has a hidden melody, you should try to find the closest possible equivalent to it. I would try to find a melody, it could be anything from classical music to a pop song, that would put me on the same sound wave as this particular text. Before translating a chapter, I would listen to this music for a couple of minutes And then the process of translation usually went almost as Mishima described. I use this method now when I write fiction, but in a more sophisticated manner. I have collected an audio library of melodies that put me in a certain mood. Every episode in a book has its rhythm, its color, its nuance of feeling, so I tune myself in. I have melodies for all shades of emotion: vague anxiety, fearlessness, unrequited love, not a care in the world, smiling through tears, anything. Whenever I hear a melody that moves me in a certain manner, I mark it and record it for later use. It does spoil the pleasure of listening to music. But you know, a writer, no matter what he does, is always on the alert for tidbits that could be used in a text. It's like in Chekhov's The Seagull, when the writer Trigorin says, "I'll see a cloud that looks like a camel, and I'll think I'll have to put that in a story." I often feel nostalgia for the era when I was a translator and could look at clouds in an unpredatory way. You cannot be a part-time writer. You are a writer even when you sleep. When I was a translator, I felt much freer. This feeling of freedom reached its peak during the perestroika years, when all the ideological taboos were abolished. I was able to publish all the translations that I had done just for my own pleasure. I was 30 when my first book of translations was published. I knew it would be a big day for my mother, so I hadn't told her anything. I wanted to show her the book already printed. We went to visit her, me and my wife. Mother looked at the book, then she looked not at me but at my wife, and said something awfully tactless. "You married very well indeed, didn't you, my girl?" I don't know what came over her. She had always been a very polite mother-in-law. None of my later achievements impressed her to that extent. I was a translator for 20 years. In Russia, it was like belonging to the clergy or a sacred order. Philologists formed a kind of community with unwritten rules. Some things were just not tolerated. A critic, a translator, a researcher of literature could experiment with writing poetry or fiction, but it had to be serious fiction, that is, sophisticated, dark, and respectably boring. Most of the literary awards in Russia go to this sort of writing. I'm often asked why I took a pseudonym when I started writing fiction. The answer is simple: cowardice. I was working for a highly esteemed literary magazine. I was a translator with a name. Had it been known that I publish, for God's sake, crime novels, I would have lost face. So, for as long as possible, I was hiding the fact that Boris Akunin, the new phenomenon of mass literature, was me. Sometimes I had to endure discussions about that filthy profiteer led in my presence by colleagues. Ever since the truth leaked out, I have been treated by part of that community as though I were a defrocked priest. And this is not a specifically Russian phenomenon. I have a number of friends and acquaintances in the Japanese bundan, as the literary world is called there. Japanese are much politer than Russians when they are sober. I didn't even guess that my Japanese friends were also shocked by my transformation until one of them, a professor and a celebrated translator of Dostoevsky, called me over an empty bottle of sake a traitor to Junbungaku. Junbungaku means clean literature, as opposed to Taishu Bungaku, mass literature. So it was about cleanness again. Chapter 3. Shadow's Mutiny. I shall try to explain why I became a traitor to Junbungaku, why I changed my clean profession for an unclean one. There were some mitigating circumstances. As I was approaching 40, not an easy milestone for anybody, I suddenly realized that I had lost the urge to translate. It had become a routine. and that had always been my idea of a senseless existence when life becomes routine. I was not moving anywhere. I had reached the peak of my capacity as a translator. I could translate for another 40 years and still be at the same level of skill. This perspective frightened me. Then I began to notice a new tendency within myself. I would start feeling irritated with the author I was translating. Come on, these preliminaries are taking far too long. Come to the point, would I think. Or, that episode should have been devised differently. It was neither normal nor reasonable. It was worrying. My favorite Russian playwright, Evgeny Schwartz, has a play in which the shadow of the protagonist rebels against its master because it's sick and tired of following him everywhere, and faithfully reflecting all his idiotic movements. The shadow in the play separates from the man and starts a life of its own. Something like that happened to me. When I sit down to write my first novel, I didn't bother with the smaller stuff like a short story or a novella. I felt very sure of myself. My mood was, I'll show you all. And I didn't mean readers, I meant other authors. When I finished the novel, I was immensely pleased with the result, and endlessly surprised when at first nobody wanted to publish it, and then very few people wanted to buy it. I was stubborn. I wrote and wrote till the audience gave up. And I was lucky. My fountain started to gush at the moment when a new class, the middle class, was emerging in Russia, and they wanted middle-of-the-road reading. Not too light, not too heavy. My genre fit in perfectly. Now, having published around 50 titles, I've lost much of my initial confidence. To be honest, I have lost all of it. I suspect, and am being told by unfriendly critics, that I was better as a translator than as a writer. On the other hand, this dissatisfaction probably motivates me to keep on moving. I tell myself that I can do better, so there is no question of routine. You just have to jump higher. Then, one day, maybe you'll fly and feel stars scratching your cheeks. I should add that my mother never approved of my metamorphosis. She read my novels with a pencil. She asked me questions about the plots. She watched screen adaptations and attended theater premieres. She even collected nice articles about Boris Akunin, but she was never a fan. For her, it was all a whim of mine, a temporary diversion. She just had to be patient. Right until the end of her life, when I visited her on Sundays, she would ask every now and then, "What are you writing now? Is it one of your Fandorin novels again? You should give yourself a break and write something serious." And then she'd finish with a tinge of hope, or maybe even translate something. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Boris Akunin for that wonderful lecture, and I hope that maybe one day he'll make his mother happy by returning to translation, but I doubt it. I'm afraid that this evening that's all we have time for. Boris's books are on sale in the foyer, and so Grigory will be there to sign them and also to answer any questions that you have for him. But it just remains for me to thank you all for coming this evening, to thank my colleagues at the British Centre for Literary Translation and the Society of Authors for organising this event, to thank the Kalous Gulbenkian Foundation for bringing Boris here to London to be with us, to thank King's Place for hosting us, and to congratulate once again all this evening's prize winners. And finally, to thank our speaker, Boris Akunin, for a most memorable Sebald lecture.